Welcome back to the Quillette podcast. You're with me, Zoe Booth, and today I'm with Dr. Andre Oboler, CEO of the Online Hate Prevention Institute and adjunct associate professor at La Trobe Law School in Melbourne, Victoria. Now, when I say online hate, I'm not just talking about a mean comment or someone not respecting your pronouns or disagreeing with your take on whatever war is happening. I'm not talking about the silence is violence hate. I'm talking about, for example, when a child has died, someone finds out about it, creates a Facebook page, which looks like a memorial page, lures the dead child's family and friends to like the page, and then turns the page into a troll account where they doctor images of the child and use it to mock their friends and family. Or, for example, what happened to me a few years ago when I posted a photo with a Holocaust survivor on Twitter. And, while many people liked it, it was also swarmed by trolls who told me that this person was obviously a liar and the Holocaust never happened. I think in many ways, we all have to be a bit more thick-skinned when it comes to dealing with words we don't like. But at the same time, you have to admit that the conversations that happen online do spread over into the real world. We're a society that's going more and more towards online communication, and inevitably that online communication affects the way we talk to people and behave in real life. And as you know, Quillette is not a platform that shies away from difficult conversations about topics where discussion is often chilled and suppressed because of being too politically incorrect. We do have to acknowledge that what's discussed online does have ramifications offline. And whether you're for some moderation or absolutely no moderation, which doesn't really exist, even Twitter now under Elon does have some moderation, I think there's a way to have a really intelligent discussion about it. And that's what I do with Andre here. I first came across Dr. Oboler on LinkedIn, and I recently saw that he was the expert witness in the Wertheim and Wissam Haddad case. This was a legal action in which senior Jewish leaders in Australia took a radical Muslim cleric to court after he published online sermons describing Jews as descendants of apes and pigs, among other quite disgusting things. So the plaintiffs won, but we discuss what that verdict actually means in practice and how hate speech laws are often applied, misinterpreted, or simply avoided. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. I did. I think it's fascinating, and I think what Dr. Oboler does is really important. So if you enjoy it as well, please share it widely. And without much further ado, let's get into this conversation with Dr. Andre Oboler. Andre, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell our audience a little bit about what it is that the Online Hate Prevention Institute does?
Okay, so we were set up in January 2012. So we've been around for quite a while now. And our mission is to prevent harm to people as a result of online hate. And that extends from hate speech all the way through to extremism. And at the really pointy end, we've done things like taking down manifestos and live streaming videos from actual terrorist attacks, within hours of them occurring.
So when you say harm, you mean physical harm?
It can be it can be physical, it can be mental, emotional, etc. It's the full gamut of psychological harms as well. We were set up as a harm prevention charity, which was a very particular type of charity in Australian law, and the legislation basically decrees the types of harm that harm prevention charities are there to prevent. And it goes from preventing suicide, preventing self-harm, problem gambling's in there, not really relevant to us usually, but through to bullying, harassment, physical assault, all of the stuff that could, in our case, be triggered by online content.
What are the main types of harm that you see?
So we deal with a lot of different types of harm. When we first started, one of our very early projects in 2012 related to racism against Indigenous Australians. There was a huge, and it was a small group of people behind it, but a huge number of pages that came up on Facebook with Aboriginal memes, things that were really going into what was a large health crisis at the time, with people in remote areas sniffing petrol fumes, which caused massive health issues, and other sort of welfare commentary and things like that that was really racist. The Human Rights Commission was responding to that, but we provided the legwork documenting the different pages. Some of them were taken down and people were putting them up again. They were putting them up again in ways that it wasn't always obvious that it was a new page. So it was looking like nothing was being done. So, yeah, we did a lot of work documenting that, produced a report. Then there was a whole series of RIP trolling. So rest in peace. Someone would die, usually in tragic circumstances, often a child, and people would go and mock and harass the surviving family. In one pretty extreme case, they went and set up a sympathy page. All of the family and friends joined the page, shared photographs and things of the deceased child. And then a week or so in, they started turning the picture of the child into a zombie, started making really, really upsetting posts. A page was set up for the first page to be removed. Lots of people went and joined it. And a week later, it turned out that second page was set up by the same people and the same thing started happening again. So you can imagine the distress this causes to a family in a community that's just lost a young child.
God, people choose to spend their time in bizarre ways. I just can't imagine why people would want to do that. But from what I can see, I've seen a lot of this content that you've talked about, and it seems like a lot of it is a way to signal to your group that, you're the funniest poster in this group, or you take the most risks, you do the most transgressive behavior, you say the craziest stuff. Have you looked into this much about why people are doing such stuff online?
Look, that's the behavior of the trolls, and that covers some of what I've just spoken about. A very large part of our work, particularly since October 7, has been on anti-Semitism, but also on Islamophobia. Both of them rose sharply, and that isn't really, it's not trolling very often. It's a different thing. People feel that they have a moral imperative to say what they're saying, to do what they're doing, but sometimes that content is literally calling for other people to be killed. Sometimes it's spreading conspiracy theories. It's normalizing hate first online and then into society. And as I say, we saw both the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia rise. The anti-Semitism is about 2.4 times higher than the Islamophobia, but it was higher before October 7 as well. We're starting to be monitoring repeatedly. We saw it peak sort of in the months after October 7, and then it dropped a little bit, but still much higher than pre-October 7 levels. We've just finished another sample. We haven't actually published it yet. You're the first person to hear this. We're actually seeing it rise again. So it's not quite where it was just after October 7, but it's closer than it's ever been since that time.
Can you explain the difference between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism?
That's an interesting question, because some forms of anti-Semitism are exactly like other forms of racism. So we see a lot of dehumanizing, for example. Many groups in society, when they're attacked with racism, are dehumanized in a very similar manner. The anti-Semitic dehumanization sometimes takes particular flavors. So, for example, the use of rats. And some of that is traced back to Nazi propaganda and to, very high profile uses of anti-Semitic content through history. So we see some cases that are similar. Then we see some cases with anti-Semitism that are unlike either all or most other forms of racism. So, for example, the idea that Jews are rich, powerful, even intelligent, these are used as negative attacks. Okay, the Jews are controlling the government, they're controlling the banks. It's because they're good with money, because, et cetera, et cetera. Those sorts of narratives that present something that would normally be seen as a positive really don't fit with most people's idea of racism. And particularly coming out of the US and their understanding of racism coming from slavery, etc., their view has been that racism is the combination of discrimination and power. So it has to be from someone with power against someone that doesn't have power. Now, if
Punching
you're
down.
punching down, so if your argument is the problem with Jews is they're so powerful, then you're arguing you're punching up and therefore it doesn't count. They're not being victimized. And that's where we see Jews being not fully included in anti-racism efforts or being excluded and told your racism doesn't count. And it's because they have this idea that Jews can't be victims because their racist perception of Jews is that all Jews are wealthy, powerful, etc.
Yeah, and it fits perfectly with the sort of most popular ideology in our institutions at the moment, which is, based on this sort of critical theory that all social interactions are based on a hierarchy of powers and based on if you're a man or a woman or white or black or whatever you fit into.
There is something to that argument about about punching up and down and hierarchy. However, what they're doing is they're dismissing the power that the collective has, the power of the mob. There is a power that the people punching down have, particularly when they gather in a mob, that they completely discount. I was asked on ABC Radio whether a pro-Palestinian protest and encampment at a university is anti-Semitic. And I said, well, that's not a very useful question because it may or may not be anti-Semitic, the same as anything else can or it can be anti-Semitic or not. We need a little bit more detail. So if you're having a protest and the protesters see someone who looks Jewish walking past and decide to go and harass that person, then yes, it becomes anti-Semitic. Okay, if you have a protest that goes on for an exceptionally long time, that creates a sense of hostility in a place that exceeds what, reasonable people would consider a fair opportunity to have your say, and particularly if it's taking space that's preventing other causes from also having their say, then we have a problem as well. Mm-hmm. So this is what we saw with some of the encampments.
Yeah, and I know you've been studying the synagogue attacks. We've had a few in Australia, and not just synagogue attacks, but also, Jewish kindergartens and other Jewish institutions.
I will just step in there. They thought the kindergarten was Jewish. That particular kindergarten actually wasn't even Jewish. It was a mistake that led to it being targeted. What we have seen is Jewish schools targeted, as well as, we had a case where one of the Jewish community leaders, his old house was attacked. Okay, now the person that lives there has got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the Jewish community. It still counts as an anti-Semitic attack. If there is an attack on a target because someone thinks they're Jewish or thinks the target is connected with the Jewish community, it's still motivated by anti-Jewish hate. So it's still anti-Semitic.
So what do we know about those attacks? What do you know about?
So look, our report on the synagogue attacks, it does discuss the attacks themselves, but only briefly. What it really focuses on is the public response in social media. And what we saw both in the Adus attack, and we documented it at the time, and then we just sat on it, and now the East Melbourne attack, what we saw was an immediate response in both cases claiming it wasn't real. And this is in the same sort of category as the school shootings in the US when people deny Sandy Hook, etc. It's got much more in common with Holocaust denial than it does to many of the other forms of anti-Semitism. So we had people then saying it was a false flag. It was staged. It was done by the Jewish community. We had other people then saying, it was done by the Mossad because they want to influence opinion about Israel. We had a few people saying it was done by the state government, or it was done by ASIO or the Australian Federal Police because they wanted an excuse to bring in new draconian laws.
Yes.
All of this is denying that there is a community that was subjected to a rather extreme incident of violent hate. And it's denying it because it doesn't want Jews to get sympathy. It doesn't want anti-Semitism to be recognized, because it wants the people pushing this want to be able to go on and continue to get away with engaging in anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions. So it's really an enabler, the same way that Holocaust denial is designed to enable Nazism to come back and that ideology to grow and what happened to be repeated.
Yeah. I guess my question with all of this is, I'm a heavy user of social media. I have been since I was a teenager. I spent a lot of time on Twitter. I've been on Reddit, and I've seen a lot of hate, not as much as you've seen, I'm sure, but I've seen some despicable things, and have even been, the victim. The best example is I posted a photo with my fiance's now unfortunately deceased grandmother, who was a survivor of Bergen-Belsen and death marches. And, I posted this photo of her and I on Twitter, and it's my most engaged with tweet ever. And most of those were likes, people really happy to see a beautiful Holocaust survivor now enjoying her life. But it also got, ratioed, as they say, by a huge amount of trolls and Holocaust deniers. And it was really disgusting. And I'm happy Olga, the survivor, didn't see that. I personally chose to ignore it. I've got most notifications of people I don't follow sort of muted, so I don't have to see what horrible people say. I guess my question is, that's how I dealt with that. I didn't feel like there were any real world consequences per se, aside from me maybe learning to maybe not post so much online, to be honest. I guess where does your research lead? Because people are inherently going to be hateful online when they feel like they can. What are the consequences in person?
Well, I want to go back to one thing you just said. One of the posts after the East Melbourne synagogue attack was from the Prime Minister, calling it out. The Prime Minister's post got ratioed.
Mm.
I mean, that's really, a statement from a head of state about an attack on a religious building, and it was flooded with comments rather than support. It's a really concerning sign for the country, I think, that's where anti-Semitism's at.
I guess playing devil's advocate, I'd say, but Andre, I'm sure there was a lot of support. I'm sure lots of people liked the post as well, and people who aren't on Twitter, more normal people maybe, would have supported it. How do we base our opinions just based on the hate,
Well, look, what you're arguing is that ratioing isn't a good measure, but the fact is that it's much easier for someone to like something and show support than it is to actually type up a comment. So what we're seeing is a suppression of the support from the community we would expect when a prime minister says, there's been a tragedy and we need to support the victims of it. And it doesn't.
I guess my question is, how much can we trust online hate? How much does online hate affect the real world? And it's a silly dichotomy because online world is the real world, but do you get what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, look, there is a pretty direct line between what we see online and what happens offline. What we see is the attitudes, the hate narratives being normalized within online spaces and then moving into the real world. And what happens then is people feeling that they have permission to engage in abusive behavior. And we saw that after the synagogue attacks. We saw, a number of the protests and things where people decided, for example, to go and attack the Miznon restaurant wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the online conversation, firstly in the day or so prior to it, calling that out as a target, and then the broader environment that was creating this space to say, let's move beyond just doing peaceful protests. Let's up the ante. And it's that level of endorsement, that level of permission that is leading to real world harms.
Yeah, I definitely see that happening. And you can see it with other topics. For example, with fashion, if there's a fashion trend that goes viral on TikTok of girls wearing their, pants or bikini or whatever in this way, you see the reality that girls start wearing that in person.
I mean, you talk about fashion there. I'll just share something from the report for a sec. Yeah. So this is the report. This is a comment. You spoke about fashion. Someone wrote, false flag, no way someone who seriously wanted to commit this crime would do so wearing this outfit.
Mm-hmm.
The suspect is very likely a Mossad agent, and the intent of this false flag is obvious. And we have, other comments probably self-inflicted and blame Muslims, like in the UK. The Zios did it.
Sorry, this is in reference to the synagogue attack?
This is specifically in response to posts about the synagogue attack. I wouldn't be surprised if the Israelis in Melbourne burned down their own synagogue. They, Israelis, love to play the victim.
Israelis, not Jews, Israelis, right?
But in reference to a synagogue.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is we see what's essentially word games. We see other posts referring to Zionists. But when we're talking about a synagogue, we're really talking about Jews. There's an effort to try and get away with anti-Semitism by saying, oh, we're not really talking about Jews,
Yes.
or we're only talking about Jews who support Israel, or we're only talking about Jews who believe Israel has a right to exist.
So that sort of leads me to another topic I wanted to discuss with you, which is that you were an expert witness in a recent case that received a lot of media coverage. It was Wissam Haddad and Wertheim.
Yeah, Wertheim and Haddad. Yeah.
Wertheim and Haddad. Well, could you explain to our audience? Most of our readers and listeners are actually in North America, so they might not know.
Okay, so the first thing I should say is that Wertheim, it was Peter Wertheim and Robert Gut. Peter Wertheim is a co-chief executive of the Peak Jewish Community Body in Australia. Robert Gut is a vice president of that body. So they took this case forward on behalf of the Jewish community in general. Wissam Haddad is a Muslim preacher, and he made a number of speeches within a mosque that were recorded and put on social media. And he argued these speeches were responding to the situation in Gaza and were commentary, but the speeches involved quite a few anti-Semitic tropes, stereotypes, etc. And
for example, I believe that Jews are the descendants of apes and
pigs. Yep, that was certainly in there, but also accusations that Jews are untrustworthy. That was comments about Jews controlling the media in there. There was, comments that Jews are responsible for conflict with Muslims, a whole lot of things, some of which come out of sort of European anti-Semitism going through to the Middle Ages, and some of which have roots that actually come out of an Islamic anti-Semitic tradition. And these are things that other Muslim leaders have rejected. They appear in various scriptural texts. He took some of these statements and framed them as statements from religious texts that are about Jews historically and are still true about Jews today. And therefore we mustn't trust Jews, and Jews are, again, a whole lot of stereotypes. So the case went to the Australian Human Rights Commission, which is a government body. They don't make judgments. What they do is they bring the parties together and try and see if they can reconcile the parties. That reconciliation failed. Once it fails, then it gives the person bringing the complaint the right to be able to take it to the courts. So this was then taken to court, and a number of these speeches were put in front of the court. I provided an expert witness statement explaining the link between the accusations that the plaintiff, the Jewish community people, put, saying that he's saying the following things and these are anti-Semitic. And I went through and explained why they're anti-Semitic, where they come from. The report ran to more than 60 pages and had hundreds of references,
and you've made that public, which is on your LinkedIn, I believe, or on your website, redacted.
I've shared the link. It's actually made public by the courts.
Okay, yeah.
So it's actually available from the Federal Court of Australia. One of the things I did was I included links to memory, and they have the
Which is the
exact
Middle
Middle
Eastern,
Middle East research media. I
yeah,
forget the full. I have to look it up.
MEMRI. Yeah,
RI, yes.
a great resource.
Yes. So they have documented the exact same phrases being used, and said this is anti-Semitic, and documented experts saying this and politicians saying this numerous other times around the world. So I showed not only are these statements, according to academic literature, etc., known to be anti-Semitic, here are other recent cases of the exact same thing being done and being called out for being anti-Semitic. And, that was all accepted. I've got to say, after the case, there was an effort to spin the decision. The court used the word overwhelmingly to describe the plaintiff's victory. So the people who brought the case
The
won
Jewish community.
overwhelmingly, and Mr. Haddad has been ordered to pay costs and to publish a statement online saying that he was found to have engaged in racial discrimination. However, the judge also looked at a number of the examples and said that these examples were not anti-Semitic. And he said these examples were instead discussion about politics, Zionism as an ideology, etc. Now, I don't want to say too much about that because I do disagree with some of the analysis there, and I think the judge would have come to a different opinion if there'd been more discussion in court on those particular points. However, after the case, we saw statements go up in social media saying that the judge has said that this is a victory for Palestinian advocates. The judge has decided that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Now, to be clear, the judge did say that criticism of Zionism is not anti-Semitism. For that matter, and this is me speaking, not the judge, criticism of Judaism is also not anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is when it is an expression of hate and an attack on people who happen to have that religion, part of that community, case of Zionism, who adhere to that, that ideology. And I don't think we can separate Zionism from Jewish identity. So some people are anti-Zionists and reject that, and that's fine. There's also Jews who are atheists. Fine, okay? But for most Jews, that is a part of their identity. So there is a difference between criticizing an ideology and attacking people. And the way it's worded in the judgment, and the judge did actually try and make this clear, and he said criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, but attacking Jews because of what Israel does is. And that second part has been totally ignored. And instead, they've said, okay, well, if you're attacking people because they're Zionists, now the court, and some of them have described it as the High Court, the Australian equivalent of the Supreme Court. It wasn't. This was the lowest level trial court. So the judgment's being misrepresented to try and give a green light to some of the anti-Semitism we see that is using Zionism as a code word for Jew. And I might let me just share again something else this time. So I'm going to pop up an image here. This is from just a day or two ago. It's a post on Facebook. The profile picture says, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and it has a map of both the occupied territories, Gaza and Israel, all covered in a Palestinian flag. So this is a post very clearly saying from the river to the sea will all be a Palestinian state and Israel will be eliminated. That's just the picture. The comment is, if you believe that a, in quotes, state committing genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the deliberate starvation of a people has the, in quotes, right to exist, then you are the problem. Now, that post is very clearly anti-Zionist because it's rejecting the idea that Israel has a right to exist. But it's also anti-Semitic because it's saying that if you believe Israel has a right to exist, you, the person, are the problem.
But at the same time, I'm not Jewish and I believe that Israel has a right to exist. So why is it anti-Semitic?
I would say it's anti-Semitic because most Jews are Zionists. So this is saying that most Jews, Jewish people collectively, are the problem.
Yes.
Now, other people may hold that belief too, but this is particularly targeted at a particular community,
Yes.
which is a group that is protected under the law.
Mm. Yeah, and you wonder with some of these people, are they just that poorly educated that they really don't know how important Israel is to Jews?
So,
It's a mixture
so,
of things.
so I had a long conversation with the person that posted this before they posted it, and they at that time were saying they don't object to Jews believing Israel should exist. They don't object to Israel's existence. What they object to is the idea that people can be Zionists and not be held responsible for everything they see Zionism as being responsible for. And that includes all of the impacts on Palestinians since 1948, as well as all of the the suffering in Gaza, etc. now, right? But they're directly holding anyone. If you say you're a Zionist, if you believe Israel has a right to exist, then we're saying you're also responsible for everything that's happened, which is a bit like saying if you believe Australia has a right to exist or America has a right to exist, you are personally responsible for every bad thing that happens that the government does or that has happened to any people within the country, etc. It's a collective guilt assignment of punishment, etc., to people based on effectively their identity.
Yeah, and it does feel like Jews are the only group that is sort of that this double standard applies to. Although you study online hate more than anyone else, do you see this double standard being applied to other groups of people?
We're seeing it from two sides here, but it's all moving in the same direction. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, there is a conflation that says that if something is anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian activism, it can't be anti-Semitism. So it's either anti-Semitism or it's pro-Palestinian advocacy. End of story. They're not even willing to consider it might be anti-Semitic, that there is that it's even possible to express something pro-Palestinian in a way that is using anti-Semitic language. They just can't conceive of that and won't accept it. On the other side, we see now a discussion of not just Islamophobia, but anti-Palestinian racism. And the argument being put forward there is people are having their reputations damaged. They are having investigations into them at work because of their social media posts. Some are facing disciplinary action because they've engaged in pro-Palestinian advocacy. And in this case, we have a conflation saying anyone engaging in this advocacy couldn't possibly have done anything wrong. There are no grounds for a company to have a disciplinary hearing about someone because of the way they express their pro-Palestinian advocacy. So on the one hand, nothing is anti-Semitic. On the other hand, everything is pro-Palestinian racism.
Yeah.
Sorry, anti-Palestinian racism.
Don't you? It feels like they, aka the pro-Palestinian crowd, think the exact same thing about the pro-Israel crowd. They think they're being silenced and victimized, and that Jews or Israelis or pro-Israel people are always saying they're the ones who are victimized. But what does the evidence actually show?
Look, I don't think, I think they say that. I don't think they believe it. I mean, in Melbourne, there's been continuous pro-Palestinian protests. There's been like two rallies against anti-Semitism. And even then, they attacked the rallies as being pro-Israel, even though they were very clearly about anti-Semitism. So there's an effort to silence others when others are hardly speaking, and then to claim they're being silenced if there is any pause in the continuous flood of pro-Palestinian activism. So, yeah, I don't think that's a serious argument, but it is certainly being said.
Yeah. And look, one of my biggest concerns as someone who grew up in Newcastle with no connection to Jews, Israelis, barely any connection to the Muslim community either, I was very, like I think a lot of Australians, I had no idea really what was happening in Israel or Palestine, or and knew nothing about anti-Semitism either. So um, I'm concerned that a lot of, everyday Australians who don't have a connection to the conflict are seeing such a sheer amount of content, which I would say the vast majority tends to be anti-Israel content. I'd like to know if you've got stats on that. But that this constant marinating in this content every day online is effectively brainwashing people, so that when they do meet a Jew or they do meet an Israeli, they've gone into that conversation, that meeting, with a lot of preconceived ideas because of what they're seeing online.
Yeah, I'm just looking down at my phone here. I can't put this one up on the screen, but a conversation, conversation I saw online. Someone is, and this is just a regular person, but they clearly absorbed a lot of the anti-Semitism. So they're saying what's going on in Gaza and the food crisis, etc., is due to repugnant Jewish supremacy at its finest. At least you're honest and both don't bother to hide it. Pure unadulterated arrogance, muzzle tov, this person writes. From a
This
guy
is a
called...
public comment?
This is a public comment.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
the person they wrote to replied to them and said, "You're not hiding your anti-Semitism based on false assumptions. You know nothing about me." And the person writes back, "Anti-Semitism is a vexed term, my love. Arabs also spoke Semitic languages. You are Ashkenazi with zero ties to the Holy Land. You're an imposter. See, I know who you are."
I think I know who this person is, by the way. We'll discuss that later.
Well, this, I doubt it, just because there's a lot of people saying similar things. But this person goes on and he's buying into a whole lot of different conspiracy theories, including this Khazar conspiracy theory that Ashkenazi Jews aren't real Jews,
There's
that
a word for that,
Palestinian...
right?
Yeah,
Kaiser.
yeah. So, and we get into... It's long post, so I won't go through it all. But the point is that there's these attacks saying that Jewish people are not real Jewish people. There's this idea that from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that you can't trust the media because the Jews are controlling the media. I've got to say, in Australia, we know who controls our media. We have not a huge amount of diversity in our media. We have these other conspiracy theories. Jews are controlling the government, etc. If you look at what the Australian government's actually doing, it's definitely moved in a much more pro-Palestinian position. But it doesn't matter what's actually happening, what the facts are. No, it's all part of a Jewish plot.
Yeah, there's an answer for everything.
And this is being absorbed by people who may have not come across the anti-Semitism before, but through the discussion on the current conflict, those discussions get saturated with, very well-tested anti-Semitic tropes and narratives, that some of which have been around for literally centuries, and people absorb them and repeat them. And social media is really, really spreading this. It's taking it viral.
Yeah, and I'm reluctant to, compare it to Germany in the 1930s, but it does seem to be, without being an expert, it does seem to be what was sort of happening there at that time, that slowly over time, rhetoric ideas become normalized. And so then when really, really bad stuff happens against Jews, when Jews are being physically assaulted and hurt, there's a basis for it. There's a sort of justification already there. People are groomed and primed.
Well, or just an acceptance that this is not a real issue. And, you talk about being hurt, etc., or synagogues being set on fire and literally the same night, the windows of Jewish businesses being smashed. I mean, this is literally what we saw during Kristallnacht.
So what to do?
You'd like asking easy questions. Yeah, look, part of the problem we're seeing at the moment is the tech companies have really reduced their capacity for dealing with online hate, particularly over the last 6 months. We've seen a massive stepping back. And that includes both what their AI is automatically dealing with, and what the human trust and safety staff are doing. And we did some work recently actually looking at the company's own transparency reports, and you can see this very clearly. And they were quite transparent that they were going to do this. They argued that they were going to improve freedom of speech by reducing the number of things that are incorrectly removed. So in order to reduce the number of things that were incorrectly removed from 200 to 100, the number of things that are not being removed and should have been goes from 1 million to 10 million, right? This is the problem. The calibration's wrong.
To get back to the foundations of it, how does moderation actually work on Meta and X, for example?
On the first, it could be improved. On the second, it doesn't work.
Okay.
That's the short answer. But yeah, look, moderation happens at different levels. So if we start with meta platforms, so Facebook and Instagram mostly, Threads and WhatsApp to a different extent.
Threads.
So the first thing is, if you're running a page or you have stuff on your profile, you have an ability to remove stuff. Okay, someone's posting abuse against you, you can block them. You can remove content on a page. That's done by the user. The next level is, if stuff's happening in a space that you don't control, you're not an administrator, you can report content. And if you report content, it used to go to human teams around the world to look at. Now it mostly goes to AI. And generally speaking, the AI is now rejecting all complaints because they've calibrated it to almost never accept anything. It used to accept more. So when it's rejected, you now get an option to say, do you want to request a review? And you can request a review. And sometimes that goes to a human. It seems that sometimes it's going back to the same AI. And I don't understand, if the AI said no the first time, I don't understand why it's going to give you a different answer the second time. It's a computer. It's not a person. So
but even before that, like even posting, nudity or gore, things like this, there are filters that automatically recognize what that is, right?
there are, but that has been wound back. They were capturing, or Facebook at least was capturing, like 95% of the hate speech before it was even posted or before anybody saw it. So you would post something and it would immediately go through automated checks before it appears. That's been wound back. It's still there, but very little is being automatically removed.
But with images, it's automatically blurred or automatically removed.
So this is an interesting thing about the US. When it comes to nudity, the US is much tougher than when it comes to hate speech and even incitement to violence. So the same day that Facebook announced that their policy was not to remove Holocaust denial, this was many, many years ago, the same day they announced that they were banning any pictures of breastfeeding mothers. And okay, because a breastfeeding mother is clearly showing nudity and therefore inappropriate. They reversed their decision on the breastfeeding issue relatively quickly. There was a huge backlash. Their position on allowing Holocaust denial lasted for about 10 years, possibly longer. It has changed now, but for a very long time they were saying, no, people have the right to be ignorant and wrong about history. Right. And then they changed it. And when they changed it, that was when they said, we don't allow denial of mass casualty atrocities. And they included the Sandy Hook incident and Holocaust denial in the same policy on that. But it was a battle for more than a decade by a whole range of organizations saying, this is not right. You're allowing Holocaust denial and through that anti-Semitism to really spread in society.
What about the argument that I myself have said many times, which is that I prefer to know who's a Nazi and who's not, and where the Nazis are?
So the problem with that is that social media is an amplifier. Okay, so you can say, well, if people are going to be violent, I would rather see them attack someone and then maybe they can get arrested. You then go and put them in a room filled with automatic weapons, invite them to a gun show where automatic weapons are free for people to try. This is not the same circumstances. There's a level of harm that gets accelerated. So I would suggest that social media has different rules to society in general. It needs to be a little bit more protected. We've seen platforms like YouTube, for instance, they often don't take stuff down. Instead, what they do is they remove the ability to share it, and they remove the counter of the likes, and they remove the ability to comment. And in other words, they host the content, but they remove all of the social interactions and all of the metrics and things that, and the monetization of it that might help it spread. What we're seeing is people are now responding to that by saying, okay, I'll use YouTube as my storage space, and then I'll use X, or I'll use Gab, or I'll use some other platform, Telegram, in order to promote it. So people are finding ways around that. Frankly, I think if the content is harmful enough to be, reduced in that way, it should just be removed. It adds zero value to the public discourse.
I know, and I agree, but I also have this, like, how do you define harm? Don't we all define harm in different ways? And it just seems like a slippery slope, which...
So that's an argument we hear from the US. That argument really doesn't work in Australia because we do have laws against hate speech, and we do have court cases, and the courts decide where the line is the same way they decide, when is touching someone assault? If you pat someone on the back, is that a pat on the back, or did you whack them and that's now an assault? The court come up with decisions. They deal with these sorts of issues, determinations all the time. They set case law, and we build on it. Hate speech is no different. And then we have the legislature. We've had laws in all of Australia on racism since the 70s. We've had laws on religious vilification at state level in different states, and now it's pretty uniform. Other than that, we have different laws in different places that protect different things. So discriminating on the base of HIV/AIDS is unlawful in New South Wales, but is not unlawful in Victoria. So really, it's up to Parliament and our elected representatives to decide which things we protect and which things we don't. And if the public, want to see change, then they need to lobby their elected representatives and ultimately try and get it into a platform of a party running for election and change the law. And that's how we work as a society.
My concern is, don't these laws sometimes backfire? For example, I hate seeing Holocaust denial, and I think it shouldn't be allowed. But at the same time, I've publicly criticized people saying that there's a genocide in Gaza and that there's, am I going to then eventually come under fire from the same laws for denying a mass casualty? Because...
Well, you're confusing the platform's policies with the law. So I don't think that the platforms have determined that what's happening in Gaza is that sort of an incident. Okay, and they could. There's pretty strong arguments that it doesn't qualify as a genocide, and that's based on the fact that there's a lack of intent, and that's required. And the term genocide has been watered down immensely, but there is certainly suffering in Gaza. But that's part of a political debate. Now, when it comes to the actual law, Holocaust denial, we don't have a law against Holocaust denial in Australia. What we do have is a law against racial vilification. And we have a case that went to the courts. It was Jones and Tobin. It was the first case related to the internet in Australia, related to hate speech. And Frederick Tobin was a world-famous Holocaust denier. He ran something called the Adelaide Institute. And he was saying that basically Jews are not real people. He was attacking Jews as making up the Holocaust, as a whole lot of really negative things. He accused Holocaust survivors of lying, and it went to court. And the court said that the things he was saying about Jews went beyond just being offensive, right? They went into this category of abusing people because of their race, because of their identity. So what's the consequence of that in Australia? He was ordered to take the content down. Okay, our racial vilification law in Australia, and see, the penalty is you have to pay the costs of going to court, the same as you do if you want to have a dispute about your fence. Okay, if you lose a court case, generally you pay the costs for the other side as well, and you can be ordered to apologize. This is not criminal law. This is civil law. The penalties are close to non-existent. What is the penalty that Mr. Haddad faces? He has to pay the costs of the case that was brought against him, of the other side, their lawyers' costs, and he has to publish a notice saying he was wrong. This is the same as happened to Andrew Bolt. This is not unreasonable, and the amount of effort that someone who has been attacked has to go through to go to court, it could take years. The Jones and Tobin case took a decade to get someone to be told they must apologize. There's actually a really disproportionate thing between the amount of effort and the actual consequence.
This is quite different to the UK, right? I'm not sure if you know about the UK, but
The UK has a different onus of proof, but in the UK, most of these sorts of incidents are actually handled as public order matters. So
so
they
police
are
turn up
handled.
at people's doors and stuff.
Well, police handle them, but a lot of the time it's dealt with a relatively small fine. So our police, some of the stuff that goes on, they really could deal with under public order things, but they don't. We've had cases of neo-Nazis standing on the steps of Parliament making Nazi salutes, and they had to wait for the Parliament to make new laws to ban the Nazi salute. Police, there are laws. They could have said these people were making a public nuisance of themselves. And yes, they might have got, $100 fine or something, but instead police just stood by. So, because there weren't any lower level penalties, it's been left to the Parliament to come up with more serious penalties.
So what do you think should be done in terms of changes to laws?
Yeah, look, I think that the first thing we need to see, social media is really driving a lot of the problem. And I think the change we've seen in the last 6 months from the platforms is really problematic. And we need to get back to a level where 95% of the hate was removed automatically. And yes, people have a right to appeal if they think something's been removed and shouldn't have been. That is much better than removing just over 50% in order to meet the requirements in the European Union, which is what they're trying to do at the moment, to just squeak past the minimum that will save them getting in trouble. That leaves such a volume of hate out there that it's impacting societies around the world. And the platforms are responsible for that. So first we need to see that change. The next change we need to see is really greater public understanding, specifically in the case of anti-Semitism, but for some of the other types of hate as well. We need to see public understanding of what this hate is so people can recognize it. And we need people to understand that they need to stand up if there is an incident like an attack on a synagogue, or as has happened in the last 2 weeks, there's been 5 attacks on one mosque, attacks of different types.
Which mosque is that?
So it's the mosque in Melbourne, in the centre of town. It's where the offices of the peak Muslim body for the state is. So the mosque and their offices are in the same building, and they had an envelope with white powder put in their donation box and had to evacuate and check if it was anthrax. They've had people being verbally abused as they enter the mosque. There's been a whole series of these incidents in the last 2 weeks. That's not appropriate. And rather than trying to deny that attacks on a synagogue are serious, we need to get all of the different faith communities to say places of worship should not be attacked. People should not be harassed when they go in to pray. And we need to unite against all of this, regardless of which community is impacted. And we used to do that. And that's broken down. And that is really concerning. It says something not just about any one particular type of hate, but about the social cohesion within the community.
We've been going for a while, but I do have 2 questions I really want to get an answer from you. So do you have any stats on different types of anti-Semitism online?
We do. So we're monitoring a lot of different online platforms. And some of them are platforms favored by the far right, like Gab, and others are platforms that people are using every day, like Instagram, for instance, or TikTok. And we use a schema for our anti-Semitism with 27 different categories. We have a schema with, I think it's 11 categories for Islamophobia. We have sets of categories for some of the other types of hate that we deal with regularly. And when we find hate, we classify it according to this schema. So in the case of anti-Semitism, what we've been seeing is most of the anti-Semitism is what we call traditional anti-Semitism. So it's one of the four major categories we have: traditional anti-Semitism, Holocaust-related material, Israel-related anti-Semitism, and incitement to violence, which we put in its own category because of the seriousness. So most of what we're seeing is traditional anti-Semitism. So this involves conspiracy theories, it involves tropes, all Jews are rich type tropes, or Jews are dirty. So we have that sort of content, which has really spiked. And then within the Israel-related category, most of it, I would say more than half of it, is in one subcategory, which is the use of those traditional categories of anti-Semitism, but being applied to Israel. So rather than saying Jews control the government in Australia, it says Israel controls the government in Australia, or Israel controls the media or the banks.
Zionists control it, right?
Correct. So this is where there's this connection to Israel or Zionism. But other than that, what's being said is the same anti-Semitism we've seen for hundreds of years. And that's really where it is. Interestingly, the anti-Semitism on the different platforms does vary. So on LinkedIn, for example, one of the very high categories is comparisons between Israel and Nazi Germany. So that's LinkedIn. If we look at TikTok, that category is moderated out almost immediately. It just doesn't really stick around. So this comes down to the choices of the individual platforms and what forms of anti-Semitism they recognize.
LinkedIn's a funny one. I found you through LinkedIn. I've been connected to a lot of really interesting people, but and it seems that LinkedIn has had a lot more engagement since, I believe I read since COVID, LinkedIn has really popped off and the number of users on it has grown compared to other sites.
So I forget the year, I think it was pre-COVID, but LinkedIn used to be an independent platform and then it was bought by Microsoft. Now, there's not very much Microsoft branding on LinkedIn, but it is a Microsoft product. Microsoft did not really engage with the internet very much. And this was a deliberate choice because way back when, Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with Windows. And they were taken to court in the US on an antitrust case. And the court threatened to break Microsoft as a company up because it said they were abusing their monopoly power. So one of the results of that is Microsoft said, you know what, this whole internet thing, we're going to step back and let other companies deal with that. So, that's where really you saw Google and others have less competition because Microsoft stepped out of the picture. Microsoft was not really engaging with social media, and then they re-entered that market by buying LinkedIn. And until then, LinkedIn had really been very professional focused. Once Microsoft bought it, this idea of bring your whole authentic self to the platform started to be pushed. And that meant people started posting more political type content and content that was not related to their work directly, but related to causes, values, etc. So we've seen, particularly since October 7, we've seen a huge amount of political advocacy on LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And look, I've definitely used it for that reason, but I'm concerned. It seems like it's quite easy to make a fake account on there, but they look like legitimate people because, it's LinkedIn and there's this level of trust. Like, oh no, they're a person and they've got their, Sally worked at this company, but it looks a bit sus.
Yeah, I mean, that happens on the other platforms too.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had multiple fake accounts of me set up on Facebook in particular. It's, the number of, I'm sure you've seen messages from friends to say, if you're already my friend and you're getting friend requests from me, it's not me. Right? And a lot of the case now, that's just people trying to engage in scams. So the platforms do have a problem with this. There's also a proliferation of fake accounts that people set up in order to harass others, to engage in debate with an account that if it gets banned, they'll, yeah. sock puppets. They'll just throw it away. So, I was in a hearing in the European Parliament, and I testified with some other experts, and then representatives of the platforms testified. And Canadian MP asked the representative of X, so you have however many users? And the person said, yes. He said, how many of those are real people? And the response was, I'll have to get back to you on that, right? Because the proliferation of fake accounts, duplicate accounts, etc., is huge. And that is not only an issue for users of the platform, but they're selling those numbers to advertisers that this is how many people we have. Does an advertiser really want to be paying for their ad to be put in front of a bot? And that's what's happening now.
Yeah, so do you think that users should have to verify their identity?
Well, there's an issue of what we mean by that. Okay, verify your identity could mean linking it to your real identity, which means related to government issued ID. And I did some work on digital identity related to an overseas government. There's lots of challenges with that. And there's also questions of if you link it, then that makes it possible to link the social media posts to things like tax records, to things like health records, right? It makes that much easier. And there are privacy risks with that. On the other hand, verifying that it's you and you're a unique person disconnected to any other information about you, that should be possible. On a lot of platforms, it's done with phone numbers. Most people only have one phone number, okay, or maybe two. And if it requires a verification periodically that it's going to send you a text and you're going to have to get the text, that's a way of verifying that this is a real person connected to something that they're paying for that is somewhat regulated. I don't know when you last got a new phone number, but in Australia, when you get a new SIM, you actually have to provide government ID. The SIM is actually linked to you. Okay. But someone who's connecting just with your phone number, there is a way of going to the phone company to then get the details of the person, but it is disconnected.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I guess at the same time, you can create multiple Instagram accounts and you could use one to harass whoever you want, but what consequences are there? I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, you might know about this. There's a anti-Israel account called Don't Be Like Bob. Have you heard about this account?
Yes.
And I've heard there's some sort of investigations into, police investigations into who this account is, and I've heard it's multiple people. So do the police actually investigate who's behind these anonymous accounts?
So recently, the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism, Gillian Siegel, put out a plan for combating anti-Semitism in Australia. And one of the things she's called for is greater resourcing for police in order to be able to unmask anonymous accounts. Police do have the capacity to do this, but the amount of time and effort involved is disproportionate to the number of incidents that occur. So serious incidents, yes, they can unmask them, but it takes a level of commitment and it takes a willingness to put in those resources. I mean, I compare it, again to the Haddad case. It took a number of years in order to get a court order for an apology. Yeah, there's a question of, is it really worth it? And I would say it is in that case because it set a clear line that the sorts of things that were being said can't be said, right? And it's not yes, there is an order that he mustn't do it again, but it's not really about him. It's about settling the law and settling, public expectations of what is and isn't legal and appropriate in Australia. So you don't have a court case every time an incident occurs. You have a court case when it's the right case to pursue.
Do you have any tips for verifying images? I often try to use Google reverse image search or
TinEye is
Kimeye
the
or
other one.
Kineyes.
Yep.
Yes. Is that the best out there for civilians?
There are other sites. Look, we generally do quite well just with reverse image searches on Google. It does. So they put in guardrails. It will find images. It will refuse to identify people. right? And it used to do more of that. Now it's becoming less and less willing to do that sort of matching. You can try other sites that may not have those same guardrails. We use it because, very often there'll be profile pictures, and we've got an account, or someone sent us an image, let's say, of a death threat, and we want to share that, the account with authorities, but all we have is an image. So we have the comment and we have the profile picture, and the name might be something very generic. So, we have to then go look at it. And if it's an artistic profile picture, we can find it. If it's an actual picture of a person, we might not. I would say just to be careful, though, because sometimes it's a picture of a real person, but the person whose photo it is has absolutely nothing to do with the content.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually had that happen to me in high school. People stole images from my Facebook and made a horrible Tumblr account about me and acting like it was me saying all this horrible stuff. So it's been going on for a while.
So we had one where they took I've had on me personally, but also the Online Hate Prevention Institute. Someone set up a fake page and then used the fake page to go and harass people and to say that they can't do anything to us because we're the anti-hate organization. So we're allowed to abuse people. And, thankfully we have relationships with the tech platforms. So when we have something like that happen to us, we're able to go directly to the companies and say, hey, we need some action on this. I last spoke to Meta less than 4 hours ago. Okay. And part of that meeting was that there's currently a major incident going on. There's a charity in Australia called Collective Shout, and they've just had a big campaign that's led to a whole lot of online games being removed. These were games that were promoting, child sexual exploitation, were promoting rape, were like, they sent one example to the classification board. It wasn't given, an 18 plus rating. It was just deemed illegal in Australia, period. And quite a lot of the other cases they came up with, that a list of hundreds, were in that same category. So the games have now been removed, and individually and as an organization, they're receiving death threats. They're receiving, it's a women-run organization, they're receiving threats of rape, they're receiving threats of being doxxed. This is all happening right now. So, this is the sort of case where, as an organization, we're able to bridge the gap, gather the evidence that's needed, talk to the platforms, and try and get a rapid response, because potentially people's lives could be at risk.
Yeah. So can people report things to the Online Hate Prevention Institute?
People do. We don't run a public help desk for reporting. We just don't have the resources for that. We're a small charity that's reliant on public donations. We don't have the sort of million or multi-million dollar grants that government gives to some other organizations.
I can see you've got a guide on your website to reporting hate on different platforms.
To the platforms, but as I say, in the most serious cases, people do get in touch. And when it's sort of really extreme, and that includes terrorist content and incidents like this one with Collective Shout, we do step in. And we also do it the other way. Sometimes accounts are targeted and the platform's AI or even staff go and close an account, and it's done, because of false reporting. So, we've also managed to get a number of accounts reinstated, because we're able to say, this account's actually an anti-hate account. This is what they posted. Yes, they posted something, that was saying, Nazi symbols or whatever, but they did it because they were calling for people to go and report that account. Yeah. It was actually an anti-hate response.
Yeah, Quillette runs into these issues all the time, and I actually feel like we're shadow banned on Facebook because of a post we made. It's sort of about erotic fiction, and there was a picture that was a little like very tasteful, like one of the images you find on Unsplash or Shutterstock or something, and I feel like we've been flagged as adult content ever since. And then, learning curve for me on YouTube has been that you can't show even an image of the Twin Towers on September 11th without your whole video being demonetized, yet people say other crazy stuff on YouTube. It doesn't seem.
That's probably an AI automation that's trying to prevent 9/11 conspiracy theories.
Okay. That makes sense.
Because there's a lot of that on YouTube. And most of it's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and then, we talk a lot about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and we have to be, or Nazism, like, and we have to be careful just mentioning those topics on YouTube because they get flagged.
And again, you need to learn how to navigate within the rules. But frankly, I think that's a good thing that they're on the ball enough to pick it up. And it is difficult, if you want to have AI that recognizes planes flying into the Twin Towers, and statistically 99% of that is 9/11 conspiracy theories, that means there's 1% that is legitimate content that
Yeah.
shouldn't be impacted.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to separate that 1%.
Well, Andre, is there anything else you'd like to talk about today?
Look, I just think at the moment we are incredibly busy. Online hate is on the rise. Society is becoming much more fractured. And, I'd just end by, appealing to people to be kind to each other. And, if you see a problem, if it's safe to do so, speak up. If you don't feel safe speaking up, do report it to the platform, even if it's likely to be rejected. Having that report lodged does help.
Great advice. Well, thank you so much for the important work you do.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thank you.